our faculty moderator for this session. I want to welcome Dr. Jimena de Silva Tavares, our chemistry professor here at Bakersfield College, who will be doing the introduction for Dr. Lindsay. You all are for treat. Thank you.
I'll keep it brief because you're here to see him. So Dr. Lindsay is an American-born author, mathematician, and political commentator, and written several books spanning topics like religion, philosophy of science, and modern theory, including two more well-known books, Critical Theories and Marxism. And he's also founder of the site newdiscourses.com, which you encourage you to visit. And we, there's quite a bit of science faculty around this talk. So I'm just really excited and grateful to have him here today because he's also involved in what's come to be known as the Greek Studies Affair, also called the so-called squared. And what that was is he presented some of him and his colleagues, Helen Freckles and Peter Bogosian. So I get stuck on my names. He presented some papers to some social science journals where it just had all the right buzzwords, and those got published, and it wasn't real research. So those of us who do science and we're serious students of science, think that that's important. That's an important conversation to have because it's important to know the limitations of the peer review system, and it's also important to retain our ability to question the status quo. So with that, super excited to be here.
Hey everybody, thanks for coming out. I'm excited to be, and I said at lunch today, I'm excited to be in part of California where you can't see the ocean. It's my first trip to, Center California. It's very exciting. I actually like the desert. I like that I can see oil production behind us, which is funny. Actually, speaking of the Repressive Studies Affair, or more specifically the science faculty present. And kind of what I want to talk about in this session today. I actually want to talk a lot about words, so sorry, science faculty. But I actually think that what makes what I'm going to do easier, I don't know if you know much of my background, my bachelor's degree is in physics, and my master's and PhD are both in mathematics. And what I think people ask me a lot of times is, how do you do what you do, which is to analyze all of this kind of Marxist and critical theory, and now the so-called social justice or woke literature. How do you do this? The way that you do it, the way that I do this, is that mathematicians and scientists are really, really particular about what words mean. When we, especially, I'm going to look down my nose at all my scientist friends here as a mathematician, when we make a definition in mathematics, that definition has to be true in every case, all cases, and create no loopholes. It has to be perfect. It has to describe exactly what we mean, exactly what we're talking about. And we don't, read the definitions in a book when we're doing research mathematics. We have to make the definitions. We observe some phenomenon that's taking place in numbers or patterns of numbers or in some kind of a calculation or whatever it happens to be, some kind of analysis, some algebraic phenomenon, whatever it might be. And we have to give the definition to describe the thing we think we see. And we have to make sure the definition is absolutely exactly what we mean, because if not, that which follows from the definition is going to be different. I'll give you a little example. I know you didn't come to hear a math lecture, and I haven't given a math lecture in 10 years, so we're not going to do a math lecture today. I'll give you a little example. A lot of you are probably vaguely familiar with a concept called prime numbers. This is something you're supposed, I know that things have changed since I was in school, but you're supposed to learn about these in like 4th grade. So if you didn't learn them, I know. I mean, I joke, but actually right now, numeracy, academic competence in mathematics skills across the board on average in the United States, about 30% of students are learning mathematics at grade level right now. Our education system is failing tremendously in mathematics, and it's only doing slightly better in reading. In actual literacy rates are very low as well. There's a problem happening there. So I am joking, but you've heard of prime numbers. Prime numbers are numbers that are only divisible by 1 in themselves, right? So you can take some other number, say like 6, which is a composite number, and you can break it down. You can say, well, what's it divisible by? It's divisible by 2. When you divide it by 2, you get 3. So it's divisible by 3. And when you divide it by 3, you get 2. So that's all of them. Okay. So it has these factors, 1 and 6, and then also 2 and 3. So it's not only divisible by 1 in itself, it's also divisible by 2 and 3. So it's not prime. It's composite. It's composed, in fact, of the numbers 2 and 3. Primes, however, are not mathematically defined as a number that's only divisible by 1 and itself, because that's ambiguous. And mathematicians don't tolerate ambiguity in their definitions. Because what about the number 1? We take the number 7, for example, just to give you a different example. 7 is divisible by 1, it's divisible by 7, it's prime, it's only divisible by 1 and itself. But what about the number 1? It's divisible by 1, which is technically 1 and itself. Is it prime? The answer is no, 1 is not prime. Because if you make 1 prime, then the fundamental theorem of arithmetic isn't true. Because the consequences of that decision matter a lot. That definition makes a big difference. So the mathematical definition of prime is a number that has exactly 2 factors. Not 1 factor. 1 only has 1 factor. 6 has 4 factors. 7 has 2 factors, exactly 2 factors. And why do we say exactly 2 factors instead of 2 factors? Because if it has 3 factors, then it also has 2 factors. You have to have 2 of them in order to be able to get to 3. There can be no ambiguity in what we mean. And what's happening, what I want to talk to you about today is that there is a ton of ambiguity in what the words that we're using today mean. Over here, I was looking at this poster before we got started about sustainability, sustainable path to peace and prosperity, by a history professor, Beeman, I think is the name it says. And it says that the term, it says right on the poster, you can look at it freely, that the term sustainability arose in agriculture, and that's the context he's talking about. Arose in agriculture in the 1930s, and now it means a whole lot more. Doesn't it? Guess what? Mathematicians don't let the definition of prime mean a whole lot more later. Scientists don't let the definition of an organic compound drift. They don't add things to the definition later. The definition is the definition, and that is describing a thing so that we can understand that thing clearly. If you want to talk about something else, you define something else. If you want to say these 2 things are kind of similar, like bears and dogs are similar, if you look at them, they seem similar, then you figure out a way to find a category in which they both fit, and you come up with a new name for that. The reason we do this is so we can have conceptual clarity, so that we can understand one another, so we can dig into things and understand that. A lot of people have never thought about it. We communicate every day. I'm communicating with you right now, so you're participating in communication that you don't know why we communicate. Why do we speak? Because I have a vision of a thought in my mind, and I want you to have a vision of the same thought in your mind. That's why. You can thank the philosopher John Searle for that explanation. He put it in a lot bigger words than I did. The idea is I'm thinking of something, and I want you to think of the same thing. I'm thinking of a thing in a particular way, and I want you to think of it in the same way. So I'm going to expend a lot of words, a lot of mental and verbal energy. You're going to expend a lot of listening, and then a lot of mental energy trying to comprehend what I said. And most of the dialogues, if you've ever been in an argument with somebody, most of the dialogues you've been in your life are going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, trying to make sure that that vision in your mind is the same. Now, I know we're supposed to be multicultural in California, so I will be multicultural. I go to China, or I don't go to China anymore. I used to go to China a lot. I don't go to, nobody's been to China in a while. My last trip to China was in March of 2019. I came back with some horrific respiratory virus that led me having a very vicious dry cough, a high fever, an extraordinary tiredness that was 9 months too early to be whatever it was. I might be patient 1, by the way. My friend who had the same problem while I was there had come over to China a few days earlier. We were in Beijing, and he went to Wuhan. No kidding. But anyway, and yeah, I did come home on a 777 full of 400 people with that cough. When I was in China, one thing that I noticed people talking about, I don't know how much you know about the Chinese language or Mandarin. I don't know if any of you speak Mandarin or write Mandarin, but what you'll learn is just like in English, we have these homophones that people speak, and the words sound the same but mean different things. I could probably think of an example. Your, and your. Y-O-U-R, Y-O-U, apostrophe R-E, Y-O-R-E. 3 different words that mean different things. Just the one to pull there and there and there. There's another one. There are these words that sound the same. Well, turns out Chinese, this is a problem. Their syllables, their language, the syllable structure, a lot of the syllables mean a lot of things. I don't speak enough Chinese to give you good examples, but I can tell you what ma in Chinese means a lot of things. It means mother. It also means horse. It also goes on the end of a sentence to mean I'm asking you a question. Ni hao in Mandarin is hello. Ni hao ma is how are you. It technically means you good. Ni hao ma is you good question mark. So ma means about 75 things in Chinese. So I've seen these Chinese people talking to one another. And they say, da, 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 da. I can't do it. I don't speak Mandarin. Da, 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 da. And then they draw the character on their hand with their finger. Oh, okay. And then they carry on because they had to get the same idea in their head, and the syllable couldn't do it. There's an entire thing. You should look this up. Sure. You should look it up. S-H-I over and over and over again. Sure. There's a poem that was written in Chinese that's like 175 times of the characters that are all pronounced sure. It's the whole story about a lion and a cave and all the things it did. One sound over and over and over and over again. Highly redundant in that way. So it's hard to get that shared intentionality. Now, what I want to talk to you about, though, is critical theory. Not about math, not about science, not about Chinese, not about funny stories, not about sustainability specifically, except that sustainability now has more meanings. It's not just about agriculture anymore. The United Nations has its 17 sustainability goals, development goals, to transform our world. That's what we're being pushed with right now. I just read a document from UNESCO, the United Nations, what is it, educational, science, cultural organization, on my flight here, about its plans for higher education in the next 10 years, or 8 years, 2030. And the goal is to make higher education focus entirely on sustainability at every level. Every class will focus on teaching sustainability and activating people to see the world in terms of sustainability and to care about sustainability, where sustainability means realizing those 17 sustainable development goals of the United Nations 2030 agenda, as well as, this sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it's really just a document they published this year. It's their header on the top of the document. It's on their website. I didn't make it up. And the 169 targets that it's supposed to hit. Mathematician may think 17 times 10, that's 170, that's 169, but 10 per one's missing. Why? Well, 169 and 13 squares or something. No, I'm just kidding. Maybe, you never know. Things that go through your head on a plane. What do you do? So I'm reading this and I'm seeing the word sustainable has changed meaning. And this is what I really want to talk about. It's words that we think you're familiar with that have a different meaning than you think they mean, which matters a lot for those of you in the faculty when you have a situation that somebody's writing words into policy and you think that they are proposing one thing and they're actually proposing something else, or will later enforce something else because that word has a specialist meaning that you maybe weren't aware of. Everybody cares about diversity, right? What if it means 2 things? Everybody likes inclusion. What if it means 2 things? That's the problem. The other thing is that if you're not a faculty member, or even if you are, and you're engaging in discussions about these issues that become politically hot button, they cause that Chinese argument that you have to draw it on a hand. What did you actually mean has to be answered. If that's happening, you are in some argument maybe about diversity or inclusion or equity or sustainability. You're having some huge political argument. You're tearing your friends and family apart. You're reporting your professors to some office that's got administrative power over them that's ridiculous because they didn't do the diverse, inclusive thing like they invited me to campus. And the problem isn't, in fact, that you guys maybe even see the world that much differently. It's that you understand that word completely different. And the philosophers, I think, are going to get upset if there are any in here. I'm sorry. But I'm going to say that the point of what's called critical theory, which is the evolution of Marxism from about 1930 to about 1970, 75, then kind of going forward in new forms since then. It still exists, it's still happening, but it's kind of heyday was 1930-ish to 1970, 1975. critical theory exists primarily to do one thing, and it's not the thing that philosophers want me to say right now. It doesn't exist, as they would say, to question unexamined assumptions that are lying behind what you're considering. It is, in fact, to re-examine the meaning of words and reframe them in terms of structural power. It's to say, we have this idea of a university, for example. We're not thinking of how a university reproduces structures of power in society. So we need to redefine what a university is so that it is understood in terms of structures of power and, in fact, solving the problem of structures of power. The issue is that it's something of an article of faith in critical theory that these structures of power, A, exist, and B, are as powerful and influential as they are. As a matter of fact, structures of power, you've heard of systemic racism, I'm sure. You've heard of homophobia and transphobia. There are real things that are homophobia and transphobia. There's real racism. This is not at all. I'm from the South, y'all. The stereotypes have accuracy to a degree, but not totally, for a reason. I'm from the South, y'all. I know these things exist. But structural racism or systemic racism, structural homophobia and transphobia, structural misogyny, structural patriarchy are different. They're different concepts. They're not the same thing. In any regard, they're actually different. And the thing that they actually work most like, if you're going to recoil at hearing this, maybe I shouldn't say this in a California campus, is like pagan deities. They're like Zeus. Zeus controls the weather. Systemic racism controls the influences of society with regard to race. It's imposed on people. It actually is, according to the critical race literature, structurally determinant upon your life. Your very character is conditioned by the structure of racism that's created by people who benefit from it, who refuse to be able to see it, who have no will to take action against it. By the way, this is what critical race theory claims in a nutshell right now. And it is imposed upon everybody else so that the people who benefit from the structural racism continue to benefit from it, while everybody else is exploited and estranged and alienated from themselves and their society by the structural racism. This is an article of faith to believe that. And as a matter of fact, that system of power operates more like Zeus or Poseidon than it does like an actual sociological concept. Structural racism is defined such that, for example, there can be no racists in a society, but it still produces racism. Every single person in society can be a committed anti-racist by whatever definition you want, and it still produces racist outcomes and is therefore still magically or structurally determining outcomes. It structurally determines outcomes in terms of who you are. That's what structural determinism really is. Karl Marx called this the inversion of praxis, but they don't call it that anymore. They call it social conditioning. So when Martin Luther King stands up, and we all aspire to this, and he says, we're not going to judge people by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, critical race theory would answer by saying that's not possible, because the doctrine, and I mean that doctrine, of structural racism says that the contents of your character are structurally determined by the creation, maintenance, and imposition of structural racism in society. If you are white, you have access to privilege that has conditioned who you are, period. There is no equality. You are intrinsically divided from one another. And all of a sudden, the word racism means two different things. And people who are very much against racism, but very much believe in structural racism, are going to fight over that word to the point of literally ripping a society apart, or ripping a campus apart, or ripping a family apart. They literally agree, except about whether or not there's a structural force that's conditioning people, which is, by the way, a giant conspiracy theory. The trick is, it's not a conspiracy technically, because nobody knows they're conspiring. You think I'm making that up? There's a book by a critical race theorist who recently died named Charles Mills called The Racial Contract, where he rewrites Jean-Jacques Rousseau's social contract theory in terms of a racial contract that he says that all people with access to white privilege implicitly agree to, even though they've never heard of it, which is to keep white people up and all people of color down. Intrinsically divisive. This is why it matters. These are society-threatening arguments. These are irreconcilable differences between people. They all boil down to different people meaning very different things are what the words mean. One means it in one way or another that you might find in the dictionary that was written before, say, 3 years ago. The others have used process of critique to redefine the meaning of that word in terms of structural power, which is an article of faith. It's a caricature of how the world really works that follows from the way that Karl Marx described the way the world works. Structural determinism, you see, they didn't invent critical race theorists, as much as you may or may not like them, are not creative people. It is a rewriting of an older concept that Marx introduced called material determinism, that one's position in the material hierarchy, your economic conditions, determine who you are. They determine the range of your subjective experience. They determine the limits of which you can imagine the world to be and yourself to be within it. And in fact, the imposition of structural classism or capitalism, as he described it, estranges man from himself. It estranges him from being able to know who he really is, because it's conditioned you to think that this is the way the world is. This is how it has to be. I have to go to school. I have to work hard so I can get a good job and prop up the system. And what their argument is no, there's another way. We can get rid of the system. I understand we're doing pretty good with the power in this part of California, but doing away with the system is starting to cause some tangible problems for you people. And I'm glad I'm going back east. We don't have oil in Tennessee, but we have coal. And we have wood, and we're not going to have a cold winter. You guys won't either, I guess, it's California. UK's in trouble. Germany's in trouble. Sustainability is one of these words too, though. Sustainability now has taken on a new dimension. It's those sustainable development goals. It is, in fact, that we have to do certain practices. We have to behave in certain ways. We have to believe certain things about the environment, about social circumstances and social reality, or it's not going to be a sustainable situation. If you listen to what I just said about critical race theory, you accept that I might have a point. You don't have to believe everything I said. You don't have to agree with everything I said. All you have to think is that I had a point. That this is intrinsically divisive. By literally stratifying society, saying there's an axis of power that benefits some people who refuse to recognize it and screws everybody else over, which seems to be pretty divisive. You might notice that their idea of using this to guarantee social sustainability might be what we call an inversion of reality. It might be a bit of a lie, a big lie, as it were. But we have to behave certain ways, like turning off the energy in order to be environmentally sustainable. We have to behave certain ways. Let me stop on that one, because you think, well, the carbon in the atmosphere is a big problem. I'm not even going to argue with that. I actually literally spent a number of years trying to work on figuring out how to build and scale carbon capture and storage, because I was so concerned about carbon in the atmosphere problem. I no longer am sure if I believe what they tell me about it. I'll leave it at that. But what I will say is that I was very concerned about that issue for a very long time. But even somebody that I spoke with recently who's still extremely concerned about this issue, a 22-year-old young man, this is his #1 hot button issue, the environment, the CO2, the global warming and climate change, or whichever words supposed to use. I said, let me just pose one question for you. If this is such an emergency, why are the nuclear power plants turned off? And he couldn't answer. He couldn't answer. They make no CO2. I know nuclear waste is a mess. They make no CO2. Why are they turning them off? It's just a question. There are certain steps people are telling us that we have to take in order to be environmentally sustainable, some of which don't make sense. Maybe there's a good answer, but I've looked and never found a good answer to that question. Nuclear waste being dangerous isn't good enough. I also know that I majored in physics. I know tons of stuff about nuclear waste storage. I lived in the shadow of Oak Ridge, where they built part of the Manhattan Project nuclear weapons. I toured the nuclear facilities. I know what they do with the nuclear waste. I know how little of it produces compared to, say, how much coal ash is produced. I know that the amount of radiation contained in the nuclear waste is less than the amount of radiation in the concrete necessary to build the entire facility, because concrete is full of thorium, which is radioactive. I know that bananas are radioactive because of potassium, as it turns out. It was in a video. They used the Geiger counter. It was so cool. Okay, so there are certain people telling us that there are certain answers for sustainability. There's certain people telling us there are certain answers for social sustainability that I think we have good reason to question. We see families being torn apart. We see political divisiveness like we've never seen before. We see people absolutely at each other's throats. You see the Democrats doing X, Y, Z, and the Republicans saying the Democrats are destroying the country. You see the Republicans being named ultra MAGA by the president, and that we're the #1 threat to the entire world. I said we, I'm not even a Republican. I don't know if that helps. This is massive divisiveness. Whatever's happening is not working. Every state in this country that I've gone to, people are begging, what is going on? How is this happening? And the reason is it's a structural critique of words. It's the critique of words that reframes them in the structural understanding. I'm going to come a little home to the campus and talk about the key word actually is going to be inclusion. We'll build off of that one. Because what I wanted to talk about is 3 words and then really 6 words that I got off on this other tangent that they use, that they restructured specifically in order to really be able to move an agenda to keep people divided, to keep people fighting, to keep us from solving these actual problems. And inclusion is actually kind of the key one. But I'm going to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion as a suite because that's a thing. And to understand diversity and inclusion on these terms, you actually have to understand equity first. Equity is the goal. So what is equity? Equity is when you administer a system to make sure that you have fairness, right? Technically, sort of. There's an actual formal definition in what's called social equity theory for equity that compares it and contrasts it against the concept of equality, which seems similar but slightly different. Equality, H. George Frederickson writes, equality is when citizens A and B are equal, which doesn't tell you a whole lot. Equity, he says, is when shares are adjusted so that citizens A and B are made equal. There's an older name for an administered economy where you readjust shares to make people equal. It's not equity, it's socialism. I've made no value judgment on socialism whatsoever by saying that. We should call things what they are. Equity is the redistribution of shares, not just of physical or material capital, but also of social capital, so that individuals and groups are made equal. It is an administered, centrally planned economy that seeks to make people equal. Everywhere that you've ever seen socialism implemented at scale, every single place has had to administer this economy in minute detail. Turns out that people don't naturally do this. According to Karl Marx, that's because they've been mystified about the real nature of reality, they've absorbed the ideologies of the ruling class, and therefore they reproduce the existing system, and they don't know any better. But it might just go against human nature. It might actually just go against our ingrained nature, social natures, in terms of understanding fairness and reciprocity. But to administer this at the finest grain level, what you have to do is you have to install political officers who make sure that it's being installed. You have to administer the socialism or the equity through commissars. Now, the name for a commissar in the modern parlance, I'm going to shock you, is diversity, equity, and inclusion officer. That is a political officer whose job it is to make sure that equity is the highest goal, the redistribution of shares so that citizens or groups are made equal. Diversity is the mechanism by which those people are identified. You see, it is still against civil rights law in this country to hire according to sex, race, gender, etc., even though we all know that it is happening rampantly, illegally. But the law has been twisted, and we have this very unbalanced situation. On paper, you can't say we're going to do that. So what they say is that we're going to hire according to expertise and diversity. And how do you have expertise and diversity is that you understand the theory behind diversity and social equity theory. And that you have the skill to make sure that it gets implemented. In other words, that you are a political officer. See, what happened is that diversity got redefined in terms of structural ideas. Diversity got transformed into something different. If I say We should have our diversity as our strength. This is a very diverse room. Everybody's happy about that. Everybody wants there to be a diversity of views, a diversity of people, nobody being left out, nobody being unfairly excluded, nobody being discriminated. Everybody, I'm from the South, but not quite. Almost everybody belongs to that. Virtually everybody supports this. The thing is they redefine diversity to mean expertise in diversity. And you're an expert in diversity if you understand diversity structurally. And what structural diversity means is that you understand that the world is structurally determinate. The structural power conditions people through Marx's inversion of praxis, changes their character. And so what you actually need is somebody who is conscious of that fact, racially conscious, gender conscious, sex conscious. If we were Marxist, class conscious. We don't care about that anymore. Critically conscious. Those people understand what it is to authentically experience structural discrimination. Therefore, they are true experts in diversity. Diversity doesn't mean people who look different. It doesn't mean people who think different. It means people who can authentically articulate being on the bottom side, the oppressed side of these power dynamics in different domains. Diversity means that you have critical theorists. That's all it means. It means you're installing political officers. You're in California. You don't believe me. What did the Los Angeles Times say when Larry Elder ran for governor? If you don't know who Larry Elder is, I will point out to you that he's less likely than I am to get a sunburn by a little bit. He's also from East LA, if I'm not mistaken. You think that he has some structural understanding. No, he doesn't, because he's conservative. And the Los Angeles Times said that he is the black face of white supremacy. He is not diverse. Dave Chappelle controversially made some jokes about the alphabet people. But like 4 people laughed. What happened next? They wrote an article and they said Dave Chappelle told his jokes against trans people from his position of white privilege. I'd say you can't make it up, but I did the Grading Studies Affair. I know you can make it up. In fact, it's all made up. The point is, diversity got redefined in terms of having a structural understanding. You have the correct identity characteristic, or we'll speak on behalf of that correct view of identity. In other words, you're a critical race theorist, you're a critical gender theorist, you're a queer theorist, you're a post-colonial theorist, then you qualify as diverse. If you happen to look different, that's great. If you happen to sleep with somebody different, that's even better. But that doesn't matter. What matters is that you have the correct political understanding of the concept. Inclusion is the same. Inclusion has also been critiqued, which means it has been redefined in terms of structural power. The idea of inclusion is simple. We all want inclusion. I don't want any of you to feel like you can't be here. I want you to all feel welcome to be here. I went and talked to the president of the University of Oklahoma, Joe Harris, and I told him this whole thing about DEI, and he said, well, that's great, thanks for talking about. We just want to make the against politicians smile. We just want a campus where everybody feels like they belong. It's like, Joe, everybody wants that. We don't want a place where people feel like they don't belong, but if you believe in a magical set of powers of structural exclusion, then you've got a problem. So inclusion means taking proactive steps to counteract the exclusion that's in the air because of the structural power. So if somebody says something that makes somebody feel excluded, that's not inclusive. But the only thing that genuinely makes somebody feel excluded is if you invoke the structural power on them. If it makes them feel excluded in a structural way. That's all that counts. Don't believe me? Go get a crucifix. Piss on it. See if anybody gets upset. Doesn't matter how many Christians you offend. Doesn't matter if they feel welcome or not. Their story has been told. We don't have to hear it again. Inclusion means nobody feels excluded by virtue of the structural power. So if I say something that makes somebody feel triggered in regard to structural power, then they feel like they don't belong there, they don't feel included in what's going on, they throw a fit, and then they leave, and they say it wasn't an inclusive space. Now the problem is I might have said that thing 10 years ago. And that lingers because you think about it. In fact, nobody even had to say anything. There's a rock on the University of Wisconsin in Madison. A rock, a 42-ton boulder. And in the 1920s, somebody dug up a newspaper article. It turns out that there was an uncouth nickname for that type of rock that involved the N-word. N-word head rock. I don't know why. Some kind of glacial deposit. I saw the rock. I went and found the rock. It's gray. It's a rock. But it turns out that once this story had been unearthed, the idea that that rock was associated with a racial slur was in people's heads. And the rock, which said nothing, it's never said a single word, was deemed exclusive for racial minorities on campus. And at the cost of about $60,000, the campus moved the rock, which was kind of this campus thing. You guys got rock? You guys should look it up and find out. It's on a rock. You might be in trouble. They spent $60,000 to remove the rock to make sure the campus was more inclusive, and then they patted themselves on the back for making a more inclusive campus by removing a freaking rock. Anything that might make you think of that, which means somebody who said something a long time ago, well, they gotta go. They can't have a platform. You gotta fire them. Now, in the communist countries, we call it a purge. And we call making sure nobody says the wrong thing censorship or pre-censorship. Matter of fact, it can be even worse. It can be the mere presence, not of somebody who said something like the rock. It could be the mere idea that this has happened in campuses across this country. It was actually kind of big at Arizona State University, for example. Big scandal about it. Happened, I think, at University of Virginia or one of the Virginia universities as well, where a number of Black students claimed that there was no space for them that was uniquely Black on campus, and so they started being angry when people who weren't Black, in particular where somebody was white, I think was in the library, as it turned out, at Arizona State, but there was a specific like multicultural student center in Virginia, and they said that the mere presence of a white person reinvokes white privilege and white supremacy, and so the person had to leave because they were contributing to systemic racism. All throughout the critical theory literature of identity, they talk about this. They say it invokes the white gaze. I'm not kidding. In feminist literature, they talk about the male gaze that women are constantly exposed to. Sorry, girl, you ain't that interesting. You're just not. Everybody's thinking about themselves. They're not thinking about you. This is purging and censorship. So you have now with DEI, in the middle you have E, you have equity. DEI is Latin for God, by the way. You have equity in the middle, which is socialism, broadened out into a neo-Marxist identity politics perspective. And then on the ends, you have the installation of political officers and the purging of dissidents, purging and censoring of dissidents. This is how you do what communists have called for a century, entryism. This is how you have a political ideology, you install your officers, and you remove dissent. That's what DEI is in functional form. Maybe you make life suck for people, so they quit. Well, they left, got rid of the problem. Maybe they commit some error, so you have to not let them on the stage anymore. Maybe they told a trans joke from their position of white privilege while Black, after having made jokes about being a Black white supremacist back in the day, like Dave Chappelle. I don't know. Now you guys are all too young to watch the Dave Chappelle show when he had a TV show. It turns out he used to have a TV show. Before he had white privilege, he had a TV show.
Well, YouTube.
No, yeah, it's on YouTube. You guys can watch the classics. The joke was that he was blind. He didn't know he was Black. But anyway, you can't even do this. So they redefined inclusion. Now it turns out they've used the idea of redefining inclusion to redefine other ideas that are central to the political environment that we live in. In particular, they had redefined the concept of democracy. This isn't a new trick. Lenin wrote extensively on this in a book he wrote in 1917, which is the year he also conquered Russia, in a book called State and Society. He wrote extensively in the 5th chapter about the idea of democracy. In capitalist societies, he said there's no such thing as democracy. There's only bourgeois democracy. There's only democracy for the rich minority. The majority is excluded from democratic processes. Maybe they're allowed to vote. Maybe they're allowed to gather and petition. Maybe they're allowed to protest. Maybe they're allowed to do all these things, but they don't really have any resources. They don't really have any voice. Jeff Bezos can buy the whole Washington Post if he wants to, and he did. Elon Musk can buy the, no he can't. Never mind. Elon Musk cannot buy Twitter. He can try. He might end up having to. But the point is that the rich are given more speech than the poor. That's what Lenin said. And so there is no true democracy. You know where he said true democracy exists? Communism. the only place it can exist because everybody's actually equal. So everybody actually has equal suffrage, equal representation, equal voice. It can only exist. But then he also says that's the one place it's not needed because you don't need a government. In fact, you don't have a government when communism is finally tried because it withers away of its own accord after attaining its maximum state of power. That's literally what Lenin said. He says, though, that the closest that it comes is under the state of socialism, under the dictatorship of the proletariat. Under the dictatorship, you finally have a simulation of true democracy. That's what he says. Chapter 5, State and Society. And he says the reason is because it elevates the voices of the proletariat and it suppresses the voices of the bourgeoisie. In other words, you finally have real democracy. You finally get real democracy when it elevates the voices you want and suppresses the voices you don't want. And Donald Trump is the biggest threat to our democracy ever. Climate change is the biggest threat to our democracy ever. COVID-19 is the biggest threat to our democracy ever. Elon Musk buying Twitter is the biggest threat to our democracy ever. Because it allows you to elevate certain voices and suppress other voices. There's actually a whole paper about this in 1965 by the leading critical theorist. His name was Herbert Marcuse. He wrote an essay in 1965. You should read it, called Repressive Tolerance. His argument is that the right wing naturally creates a repressive state that holds the oppressed down. It is repressive. They pretend to be tolerant and allow, but they actually repress. And so you have to flip that over and have liberating tolerance. And he says liberating tolerance is defined. Democratic tolerance is defined specifically by extending tolerance to movements from the left and withdrawing it from movements from the right. That's a direct quote. That's how you achieve tolerance. By creating what Lenin said is true democracy under the dictatorship of the proletariat. We have the dictatorship of the anti-racists now, where Ibram Kendi says we'll have a constitutional amendment that says the Department of Anti-Racism will have final say over all state, local, federal policy. They'll monitor public and private officials for expressions of racism or opportunity or situations in which unequal outcomes arise and punish them if they don't voluntarily change their policy. A dictatorship of the anti-racists. It's a literal recreation of Lenin. Read it yourself. It's in Politico magazine. He doesn't actually say that he's recreating Lenin. Ibram Kendi isn't going to give away the game back, clearly, but it's what it is. So you have to have, in today's parlance, look this up, an inclusive democracy. And an inclusive democracy works to where it corrects for these structural power imbalances that prevent people from being full democratic citizens. As a matter of fact, that's the third big term that they've redefined. In order to get to our sustainable future, we have to have inclusive citizenship. Inclusive citizens are the people who live and are enfranchised within an inclusive democracy. They're the people who get elevated because they're the ones who understand the idea of inclusion structurally and will enforce it. Whereas everybody else gets suppressed because that's how you simulate a true democracy until you get communism. This is the vision. Inclusive citizenship, by the way, here's an example of inclusive citizenship. It has a number of subdomains under it. One is sexual citizenship. Sexual citizenship. If you want to know how serious sexual citizenship is, if you look at the Comprehensive Sexuality Education Program, which is an international program for teaching sex and sexuality education, promulgated by the United Nations, formed in 2003, by the way. It has 7 core agenda items. Number 3 is to teach children to be sexual citizens. Sexual citizens means at least 4 different things, according to my reading. They're relentlessly criticizing each other. But here's an example. First of all, it means what they tell you it means. Let me just be fair. What they tell you it means is being able to say yes to what you want to say yes to, and no to what you want to say no to, and recognizing other people's ability to do the same. Sounds like something we would all agree with. Turns out there's a lot more packed in that. If you watch how the left reacted in response to the Roe versus Wade decision, I have no statement about that. I'm making none. I want to be very clear for you all. But I'm not making a statement about it. I want to talk about the reaction. And they start talking about it being a right. It's necessary for women to be able to participate fully in society, be able to have an abortion whenever they want, up to and maybe after birth. This is actually part of the umbrella of sexual citizenship. You see, women are shackled to their biology by virtue of having been born with a womb. They could become pregnant against their intentions or wishes at any time. I know I didn't mean to have this conversation, birds and bees talk, y'all. If you didn't know how women become pregnant, it's that they slip and fall into a mud puddle and they're pregnant. It can happen to anybody at any time, except not in California because there's no water. Y'all are safe. Women under the doctrine of sexual citizenship are not full sexual citizens and thus not full citizens because they can become pregnant, at which point they have to split their citizenship hat with a motherhood hat. That's what they say. They have to take away time from being a fully active citizen, a fully active worker, a fully active participant in society to set all of it aside and do this stupid thing over here called raising a child. Literally kind of the most miraculous and amazing thing that somebody can do, literally the perpetuation of the species. But she has to take her citizen hat off, at least in part, to make room for the mother hat. If you put that in context, you have her sexual citizenship is being threatened by the loss of a, I'll just make my thing, badly decided Supreme Court ruling that I actually agree with. Let me show it. In case you wondered, I actually agree with what it enabled, but it was badly decided. And so here I am, alt-right, guys. I'm pro-choice. I'm crazy alt-right, crazy guy. I'm ultra MAGA. I'm ultra MAGA. So inclusive citizenship means that we're going to take this perverted idea of inclusion, we're going to attach it to what it means to be a citizen, so that we can enact inclusive democracy, so that we can make sure that the people whose voice matters to the regime get more voice, and the people whose voice is the greatest threat to our democracy ever get less voice. That's how they have redefined inclusion, thus democracy, thus citizenship. When you redefine citizenship out from under people, when the word citizen means something fundamentally different, you have a big problem on your hands. Because if we do believe in anything like a social contract that I mentioned earlier, that's where it's defined. It's in terms of what people believe their rights and duties are as citizens. And so if you get people to believe that citizen means something fundamentally different than what being a citizen actually means under the legal binding documents of the Constitution of their country, you've got a major mismatch and problem on your hands. And that's exactly the mismatch and problem that they're having. Now, inclusive citizenship, by the way, is a step to a further form of citizenship in their literature, which is inclusive global citizenship. And you should really stop and pause and think. Look in any education literature that you want right now. They'll tell you that the purpose, any education white paper, is the purpose is to educate global citizens. Let me just tell you, let me disabuse you of something you may be abused of. There's no such thing as a global citizen. This is a word game. There are people who live in the world. There are people who interact in a cosmopolitan way across borders. There are people with friends in many countries at once. They interact with them on their social media every day. There are no global citizens because there is no global sovereign. If you believe you are a global citizen, at some point the answer is, who's the global sovereign? That creates the social contract that tells us who our rights, or what our rights are and who we are under those rights. Some global form of governance that does not yet exist. Of course, that is the goal of communism, is to have one form of global governance that ensures permanent equity, but I digress. The people who are pushing for global citizenship ideology, the people who are pushing this most firmly are pushing for the S word, sustainability, as the key value. In fact, there are two key values of that world: sustainable and inclusive world for our future. There are the people at the United Nations, there are the people at the World Economic Forum, there are people at, if you're a lefty, BlackRock, which is a bank. It is not your friend, left. It's not even the banks that cheated in 2011 with Occupy and got out from all that trouble, that cheated and screwed us all over in 2008. It's like their evil extra big brother cousin that stole all their assets, wrapped them all up into one giant leverage fund, and goes around mucking around all over the world to make everybody do their bidding. It is a bank. If you're defending all this crap, you're defending the biggest, richest, most powerful, and most abusive financial institution that's ever existed. And you think you're a Marxist. Thank you. Questions? Anybody has questions? We can do it.
just recently watched
Familiar with who he is. I'm not familiar with his work in any depth.
okay, well, he's a self-described communist.
Yes.
And he's argued that socialists and communists are constantly at each other's throats because socialists, by definition, believe that capitalism does truly work, though they're fixing the one flaw of what capitalism refuses to fix anything else.
Yeah.
While communists believe that socialists don't go far enough. They are the true believers of the social revolution.
Okay.
And I'm asking you this, is that you think that socialism is part of the capitalism spectrum, and that they actually are helping the current system, but acknowledging some faults of the system and fixing those as they're progressing.
I don't think you're going to like my answer. So I don't know if you guys heard the question. Make sure you all heard the question. To very briefly summarize, there's a openly communist academic by the name of Richard Wolff, who argues that communists and socialists do not like each other. And the reason is that socialists are actually, in a sense, reformers who want to work with and improve the existing capitalist system or retain its essence, whereas communists are actual revolutionaries who want to overthrow the existing system for something completely different. Now, this is, you're not going to like my answer, because the answer is, and the question was, what do I agree with? And specifically, do I agree with the idea that socialism is part of capitalism? And you're not going to like my answer, because the answer is, the word socialism means more than one thing. The word socialism, in fact, predates Marx. It predates, so does communism, as a matter of fact. It turns out while Karl Marx was writing the Communist Manifesto in 1847, he was in a apartment or a room in Paris, and across the street, I need to go here. I actually want to find this and see it. Across the street from the apartment was this cathedral. I don't know if it's Notre Dame, but the orders for the Pope were there. I think this is Pope Leo, but I don't remember which Pope it was. There are a lot of popes. It could have been a Pius, it could have been a Leo. And this Pope was writing the strongest condemnation of communism that has ever been written. At the same time that Karl Marx was writing the Communist Manifesto across the street. And how did he, literally across the street, how in the world did the Pope condemn communism before the Communist Manifesto was published? Simple. Communism had a definition and a meaning that predated Karl Marx. Karl Marx created a specific theory of how to get to communism. And it turns out that Karl Marx said that history progresses in stages. It starts in a primitive communism where there's tribes that don't interact with one another. They're estranged from one another, but they are intrinsically communistic. Nobody owns anything. Everybody shares everything in these small, 100, 200 person tribal communities that are inherently communistic. And then it progresses to where some of these tribes start to enslave one another into what he called slave economies. This progresses into what he called feudal economies, or estate economies, which is what he was looking at from the French Revolution. And that progresses into capitalism, and capitalism gives way through a revolution led by the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is the organized and conscious workers' party, and they form a socialist state that is simulating communism until it gets the contradictions worked out, at which point the state will wither away and communism begins. So when they say real communism hasn't been tried, it's because we've never got through the socialist part. But there's a reason that the USSR, which was run by the Communist Party, has the S in there for Soviet Socialist Republics, right? Soviet means run by a council. If you didn't know that, Soviet is the Russian word for council. Like a council of stakeholders in the sustainable world. In case you missed that, or a council of DEI officers at your university. Just in case you missed that. So there's another very large school of socialism that is similar to what Wolff is talking about. He's probably, though I can't say for certain, talking about the Fabian socialists. Fabian socialism is the probably second biggest, maybe the biggest movement of socialism in the world. And it is distinguished from Marxist socialism, which is the fifth stage out of a six-stage progression in history that ends in communism. Communists tend to be people who believe that Marx's progression in one way or another can be fulfilled. And so they're going to progress through a dictatorship of the proletariat that is going to enforce something socialistic. Marx said that, in fact, the goal is to create conditions into which the inversion of praxis makes man into socialist man, specifically socialist man. He called his program wissenschaftlicher Sozialismus, the scientific socialism. So Marx didn't define socialism, he defined scientific socialism, which was his particular brand of it. The Fabians, however, are gradualists. The Fabians believe that you make small reforms, small reforms, small reforms, small reforms until the state is paying for everything. And the Fabians and the communists do not like each other for exactly the reason that you're talking about, which is why I assume that's what Wolf was talking about. Do I believe that the Fabians are part of the capitalist system? I don't know. Their end goal is not to maintain capitalism. It is, in fact, to move into a fully socialist system. The definition of socialism overall, by the way, is the state owns the means of production. Communism is the people own the means of production. So I'm not 100% sure what he's talking about. And the answer to your question is it depends on what you mean by socialism. Marxist socialism or wissenschaftlicher Sozialismus does not mean that. It is anti-capitalist to its core. What Marx says is in that stage when most of the people are there, they embrace something called crude communism. Crude communism is the hatred of private property or capital. And then if they fully awaken to a true communist consciousness, that's the trend, as he phrases it in economic and philosophical manuscripts, it is the positive transcendence of private property and the self-estrangement of man. So that's probably what he's talking about. Certainly the Fabians work within the system and try to do gradualistic reforms.
Yeah, because I identify as like the Fabian social democratic spectrum, and like basically we just believe that we try to harness both aspects of the Marxism theory as well as the modern structure and harness both positives to create the equity of a prosperous society.
Right, yeah, so, I mean, there is a lot of room in these blended economies or mixed economies, depending on who's
That's
writing.
what Europe, that's what essentially Europe is right now. They're a hybrid system of both.
Correct. Actually, so are we here in the United States to a certain degree. I actually think that if you want my full opinion on this, I think that if you look at the critical theorists in the middle part of the 20th century, they refer to what came out of that period, the antitrust, anti-monopoly, even some of the aspects of the New Deal, they refer to that as advanced capitalism. As Herbert Marcuse writes very explicitly, advanced capitalism delivers the goods. It allows people to make a better life. But then, being that he's actually a communist, he says that takes away from them their ability to imagine an even better life, which is the communist liberated utopia on the other side. And so my guess is that you do have to have, rich nations do need social safety nets. They do need programs that are kind of the last stopgap. The government, in fact, I'm firmly convinced of the belief that the government should do that which the private sector cannot do efficiently. And what we should be arguing about left and right is what is it that the private sector versus public sector can do most efficiently? And how do we safeguard the private sector so that it doesn't become monopolistic and strangle itself? BlackRock, by the way, is a gigantic monopoly. And anybody who thinks that they're on the left and supporting Vanguard Vanguard is their sister company, BlackRock and Vanguard. They literally called it Vanguard. That's what Lenin called his movement, by the way, is Vanguard to usher the proletariat through. Anybody supporting those people literally in their agendas has literally no idea what they're doing. What will happen when this corporate oligopoly takes over to the World Economic Forum, UN, et cetera, and tries to usher in its reign of whatever it's going to do, sustainability terror or whatever we call it, green terror. What will happen is that the Marxists and the Fabians will say co-optation. Our theories were co-opted by corporate interests. Real communism was never tried, and the billion people that died. Well, that's solving another riddle in the dialectic. So I don't have high hopes for that. Another question?
Convince me that I'm wrong, I'm not. With the changing of definitions, will the snake eat its own tail? Well, eventually they just all kind of implode on themselves. That therefore, even though you may be an ally today, maybe tomorrow you're no longer.
The snake has to eat its own tail. But the phrase that they use in the literature for this is and I quote, and so the dialectic progresses. What people don't understand is what Karl Marx didn't devise as an economic or social theory. That's a different talk. Maybe I could do that tonight. I'll talk to you guys in the meantime and see what I can talk about tonight. I'm excited for that. Marx created a theology, a transformation of the world into the kingdom of God. It's inverted Christianity, and Christianity turned into a process of transformation of the world to recreate Eden for an awakened man that deserves to be in Eden. Herbert Marcuse in 1955 wrote that the way back into Eden is the second bite of the fruit tree of knowledge. So what this means, though, is a dialectical process. Here's how the dialectic works. So if we go back to Kant, it's that you have some idea, it's called the thesis. The opposing idea is called the antithesis. You combine the two and you try to figure out how they're both true at the same time in some way or another. So you lift up to a higher perspective. You see it from a new paradigm where they're both true at once, and then you have what he calls synthesis. Hegel, kind of a later student down the track from Kant's ideas about the dialectic, reforms this idea into a new formulation that he calls the abstract, the negative, and the concrete. So your idea about the world is abstract. You encounter the real world, usually counterexample to your stupid belief, and that's the negative. Sometimes, though, it's a countervailing idea. And then you try to find out how both of those things are true, so that your idea didn't have to change that much in the first place, and that's the concrete understanding of what you're dealing with. And so this dialectical process is supposed to sublink after each round. It's supposed to go from abstract to negative to concrete, or if you want it in Hegel's view, from ideal into the material and then into the spirit. So the ideal is where philosophy is, philosophy conditions the way that we act in reality, so we codify that as state. So the state is the son of God in Hegel theology, I'm not kidding. It is the divine idea that exists on earth. It's literally what he said the state is. That's the definition of the state. Hegel was a bit of a statist, by the way. And then the state gives rise to conditions that people live in, and gives rise to a spirit of the times, the zeitgeist, or the spirit of the world, the Weltgeist. And that Geist level is where the contradictions start to arise and play out, and that causes eventually a revolution in thought. And the whole thing rises up on a new plane of understanding a little higher up. And this is the Hegelian dialectic. Marx just took this and flipped it upside down, and he said that the idea exists in man's head, so it becomes man-state society as opposed to idea-state spirit. It's literally the same thing flipped upside down, but what you've got now is a process, and at each stage, it's supposed to destroy the previous stage. So this is why you have Marxism progressing into cultural Marxism, which, by the way, apparently, according to the Human Rights Campaign, because you need to wonder how controversial, and the HRC, the Human Rights Campaign, you know, that blue thing with the yellow sign, so that I use all right terminology, like cultural Marxism, which literally describes a movement headed by people like Dirk Lukács and Antonio Gramsci in the 1910s and 1920s, and has for a century, but apparently it's all right terminology to mention now. Whatever. Cultural Marxism was actually the cannibalization of the material Marxism before it. This goes into critical Marxism, which cannibalizes the idea that culture is set by anybody except for the very terms of society. It's a self-perpetuating, self-reproducing system. This is cannibalized by the identity politics version that Marcuse spawned, mostly through working with Angela Davis. And so what do you see them do? They look backwards. They say that Marcuse was a white man, and so he's out. And they look backwards and they say that Gramsci was an authoritarian, so he's out. And they look backwards and they say, well, Karl Marx missed all this stuff. So cultural Marxism criticizes Marxism, so it can't possibly be a new vein of Marxism. It criticized it. Critical Marxism criticized cultural Marxism. It can't possibly be the same thing. It criticized it. And we get up to the future, and we're into this kind of mishmash postmodern thing, but Foucault is a white man, Derrida is a white man. Turns out literally that's the arguments they gave for burying the original postmodernists. Paulo Freire was a great educator, but we now have Gloria Ladson-Billings, who's a black woman. And so he was a privileged man. They actually went after him big time. The post-structural feminists and the post-colonialists really embraced Freire, adopted most of his methods, and then went after him for being male. And so it will always continue to cannibalize itself. But the problem is, that's not the thing destroying itself, that's the thing concentrating itself. The optimism that you want to find in that, the seed of optimism, is that it eventually gets so crazy that they think it's a good idea to put dry cleans in schools. They eventually have no brakes. It eventually goes all the way off the rails. Got one more. We get somebody new. I can talk to you afterwards for a minute if you want.
Okay, so you mentioned that there doesn't need to be ambiguity in words, and I agree with that. you need to have a set definition for words, but you also say that the definition of words don't change over time. You also mentioned that scientists don't change the definition of words, which is, so evolution used to be defined as an animal could have a mark on their skin, and then that would get passed on to their offspring. I believe this was from Mark. And then this got changed. So whenever Darwin cited definitions in Galapagos, the definition of evolution changed to reflect how it is viewed in science today. So the definition of words could change over time.
Not mathematics.
Not in mathematics.
Not in mathematics. Scientists are pretty careful about this. So when you talk about what you're talking about there, Lamarckian evolution and Darwinian evolution, what we're actually, you can use the word evolution for both, but notice there were prefixes. And we reject Lamarckian evolution, but we don't reject Darwinian evolution. But the reason is because the mechanism of Darwinian evolution is natural selection. Natural selection has pretty clearly defined that there's been refinements to the definition, but there's not been a wholesale revamping of the definition. There's not been a reconsideration of how we're going to conceive of the idea of natural selection in terms of what it has to do with social dynamics or some other creative thing. Now, this is exactly the kind of thing that you saw postmodern history very famously in the 90s. For example, they were going around saying things like that the theory of equality, or that the identity of equality in mathematics, has all the social implications because equality means equals in math, but it also means equality in social circumstances. They started to play around with these things. This is something humanities likes to do. And I am a big fan of multiple meanings of words and the evolution of definitions of words, but not when you're trying to have a conversation. Like you and I are having a conversation about evolution, and you change the definition of evolution, or you operate intentionally thinking I mean something and you mean something else, then what you're doing is deception. And that's a different thing. So when we're setting, say, university policy, and they say, let's add the idea that we're always going to foster critical thought. And you think, well, I like critical thought. Of course I'm going to put that in, but you know you mean critical theory, and you know I think you mean critical thinking, which are two different things. You're lying. You're doing an equivocation. You're actually misusing a word to mislead people. So what I'm talking about in that regard is if we want to have clarity, want to understand one another, we have to agree on the words in that context. If you look at most legislation starts with a definition of the terms, because in law, they have to. If they say, here in California, if they say fish, they mean also bees, and I'm not exactly sure why, but they had to put that into the legislation. They specifically say, for the purposes of this legislation, which is also a pocket universe of a sense, the following words mean the following things, and then they go. What's happening with a lot of this stuff with the policy with diversity, equity, inclusion, equity is not really actually ambiguous. You're trading off of equality. It actually only means one thing. Social equity, I mean, obviously financial equity, that's different. But diversity, equity, inclusion, citizenship, democracy, justice is a big one. They've also done this too. When they're trading off of two intentionally, when they know the word means two things and you only know it means one thing, it's a form of lying. It's like when you have, your circle of friends. I don't know if you ever played this game. I know linguistically sophisticated people do. I did. I was a jackass. Where you have like 5 or 6 people around and you're talking and you know she's going to understand what you say in a different way. So you say the thing a little awkwardly and everybody at the table isn't in on the joke you just had with your friend. You're being deceptive. And so when you're setting policy, when you're trying to have a discussion that brings you to clarity on an issue, what my point was, the whole point I want to make is that you can't do that. That's deceptive, that's counterproductive, and that's not what you do. In math, definitions don't change. We might say that we had a bad definition of prime number. We have a clearer definition of prime number now. But the definition, when it's worked out, is this definition. That's the end of till the end of time. That's what a lead group is. A lead group is just a lead group. I don't remember what a lead group is, so don't go down the spot. It's something. But what it means is not ambiguous. It's extraordinarily clear. And this is why we have all these stupid names like groups and rings and all this stuff from French, because they gave the definition 200 years ago of this mathematical object, and we still call it the name they gave it, even though it doesn't make any sense. So yes, of course, the meanings that we have, the connotations and even identifications of words evolve. What you'll actually usually find in responsible, just like saying to you earlier, turn into a gigantic argument with a dictionary whether the dictionary records or defines words. It always comes down to this. A responsible dictionarian would indicate multiple definitions. It means this in this context, often mathematics or whatever. And the goal of us communicating and using words is to get on the same page. The goal of critique is to redefine terms in terms of a particular view of the world and how it works. And the problem isn't necessarily even that they do it, it's that they then use those words without telling anybody that they redefine it. I think, in fact, sustainability primarily means sustainability of the regime they're setting up. That's literally what the word sustainability means. If you look at this thing in education called social emotional learning, that's 5 steps to the implementation of social emotional learning. I can't rattle them off, except number 5 is sustainability. Why is it sustainability? Well, for the moment, it's so that when you put it into the school, it's sustainable and it won't get taken back out of the school. I bet you that later it will transform to mean that you're teaching sustainability goals. That's tricky. That's deceptive. That's why we're in the mess we're in. When we see through these word games, which is why I wanted to expose them, they don't work anymore. It's like if I did a magic trick and like all of a sudden I have the Queen of Hearts, and you're like, how did you do that? And I showed you how you do it. You're like, oh, that's it. You just had it upside down on the bottom of the deck. Really? That sucks. Takes away all the magic. That's kind of what's happening. So sorry if that was confusing.